I wanted to ask about the election, about this year's ad spends. It's been massive all around, not just national, but local. Tell us what you attribute this year's increase to in ad spend, and give us some of your thoughts on spending in the election cycle we've just gone through.
All right. I think this year, like any other year, the spending is dependent on the competitiveness of a race. So when I say competitive, it means, are we vying for an open seat where somebody is retiring? And we saw that a lot in the country this year, as well as are we trying to send a seat from red to blue or blue to red? And in the New York DMA, we had some very competitive races as a result of that. Out in Long Island, the Republicans were trying very hard to hold on to some seats, so they spent considerably. Peter King retired, so that was a big seat with a lot of competitive spending. And then probably the most well-known race in the New York television market was the Max Rose race, where as a Democrat, he had taken over the most coveted seat in Staten Island 2 years ago in an area that has always been truly Republican, and he was able to flip it. But this year, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you see it, Nicole Malliotakis made another run for it as the Republican, and she was able to gain the seat back. So again, in my world, it's all about the competitiveness of. Cory Booker was up for re-election this year in the Senate for New Jersey. He didn't have an opponent, he had no stories to hide. He didn't spend $1. So again, back to if the race is competitive, that's where the.
Randy, so I wanted to ask about the mix of media that you see in terms of OTT and connected, and the way that people are viewing, and of course the way media is being delivered. How different was that in terms of the media buy this year, kind of cross-platform, and what are some of the implications for politics and perhaps beyond politics?
Well, I think, we usually compare even to even. So if we look back on 2018, OTT and digital did not play nearly as strong a role as they did in 2020. In 2020, we seldom sent out an avail without having a streaming capability attached to it or an IP digital attached to it. And the reason behind that is, particularly in this pandemic, people's viewing patterns have changed. And it is our job as consultants to the media world to react with different kinds of media plans. So we know very well, we're excellent at targeting the linear viewer, but this year, one of our main goals was to target people who are considered non-traditional linear viewers. And, how do we get those? How do we stay with them and follow them? And every plan we put through, in order for it to be holistic, it had to include every single component that we had available to us.
Tell me, about the pandemic and how that's changed the tone that brands have made, and how that might have spilled over to the political world if it has.
Well, it's funny. It's in my estimation, I did not see tremendous changes. The one change that a lot of people agreed upon is that perhaps the pandemic slowed down some of the fundraising ads when the pandemic first started. Originally, before you enter a window when the candidates are running, they start to ask for money. The sentiment of the country this year was nobody wanted that in their face. So there was very, very little fundraising prior to when the pandemic first broke out in March and April. That being said, most of the advertising was traditionally what you expect to see. Candidates come out with, a branding spot. This is who I am the first 3 weeks. The back 3 weeks, they followed you. This is what I've done, and this is what I can do for you. There's not a lot of mudslinging from a candidate spot. It's the issues and the PAC monies that I think everybody, that's when you see the scary ads, when they're just making claims that are just sometimes outrageous, always, backed up with substantiation. But for that part, it seemed pretty similar to me what I saw in 2018. The pandemic could have been the focal point this year, but there's always a focal point in every race, what their people are going to blame, whether it's, high taxes, poor education, things along those lines.
So, Randy, I wanted to ask about addressability, targeting, data attribution, finding the right candidate, finding the right audience for the right candidate. you guys have a very deep capabilities at New York Interconnect, and I wanted to ask about maybe some takeaways around targeting advertising for the most recent election cycle.
Well, as you said, we are very, very blessed to have a lot of robust research that lets us plan impeccably. Most of the planning that we do is on the front end, and that's why it is so important that we know who we're trying to reach. And campaigns absolutely know whether, what they're looking for, whether it's an ethnic group, whether it's a household earning group. When I first start the whole year, I'm working on primaries. Primaries are generally closed elections where only the person who's registered in the party can vote. So if I were to look at a primary, I would only be going after registered voters of a certain party. For that, I would only, create schedules that had the viewing patterns of the registered Democrat or the registered Republican who we were trying to reach. That's how we first started. And then as we get into the general election, it's so much more important that we reach more than the party that we're identifying with. So then we use our set-top box data, which is census level, and it can tell us the viewing patterns of independents, Republicans. It drills down as far as congressional districts. So I start with a congressional district and then I start with the party. And the one thing is nothing is a cookie cutter, because the congressional district for CD1 for Lee Zeldin is going to be completely different than the congressional district for AOC and CD14. There's different populations, so therefore we're going to see different viewing patterns, and we treat every campaign completely individual. There's no cookie cutting. That it doesn't work in this genre.
And for people who don't know the sector, in most advertising, there's an expected ROI like foot traffic or buy something or web visits and that sort of thing. And of course, fundraising is one thing, but what do political advertisers seek from you guys in terms of ROI? How do you, what are their expectations and what do you provide?
I guess the basic ROI that everybody in the race wants is to win. And, there's plenty of candidates that use cable only. So we become the ROI if they won. If they win, the cable succeeded. Closing the loop isn't nearly as necessary in the political world as it is in car sales or foot traffic or things along those lines, because once it's over, it's dormant till the next race 2 years from now.
Great. And finally, some learnings more broadly out of this year, and what you think will happen in terms of using television efficiently for the mayoral election and the elections ahead, both in the New York DMA with New York Interconnect, and maybe some other trends that you've seen with some of your colleagues around the country.
Well, I think that 2021 will probably not be as exciting, although we still have those two great runoffs in Georgia. I think there's such a difference when you look at a federal race. You're looking at one race that applies to the whole country. When you work in a market, you really have to figure out how every race is going to be different. So if I'm working on a race, let's say for Governor Murphy for New Jersey, that could be completely different than the mayor's race in New York City, just based on the population in these two areas. So there's never really, similarities are hard to find. The one thing that we do know is people consume television completely different than they ever have. And this was prior to the pandemic, but now it's really taken on a life of its own. We saw the HUT levels go through the roof in March and April. We're starting to see that level out now. So the question is, if we're about to enter a second stage of the pandemic, will the viewing levels go through the sky again? The other thing, which is so important in what we do, is for years, prime time and even early morning news, that was the go-to for everybody. People are home a lot more now, and 24/7 is prime time. It's no longer just 8p to 11p. So in order to get every viewer, your schedules have to be so much broader, so much deeper. We still rely a lot on news. we've always relied on fixed sports, but then we found out in the June primary, there weren't any sports because all the teams were, off on the side. So we had to bounce back and think of different ideas. And that's when we really started to realize that the streaming, the digital, the OTT, that was one of the most important plays we could add to the mix.